$25 and a woman. A deal that changed a life in the Wild West. That September, dust and wind choked the main street of Dusty Hollow. Under the faded wooden sign of the general store, a woman knelt in the mud, a boot print pressed deep into her back, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. Folks called her Clara, the wife of a drunk who no longer saw her as human. He laughed loud, boasting, "Who wants her? $25, an old gun, and a barrel of corn liquor." The crowd roared, some even clapped. The sheriff shifted uneasily, but still signed the transfer papers, as if a person could be sold like cattle. And then Jonah Callahan, a wealthy cowboy, known for silence more than words, stepped forward. He didn't argue, didn't haggle. He just pulled out the cash, pressed it into the sheriff's palm, and motioned for Clara to rise. No one in that crowd understood why a man like Jonah would take home a woman the whole town scorned. But from that moment on, Clara's fate turned down a road no one could foresee. And this story, of shame, of blood, and finally of rebirth, will hold you to the very last breath. The first chill of winter cut through Dusty Hollow, whipping red dust down the main street in ghostly ribbons. In front of the old general store, where the warped sign creaked in the wind, a sight made passers-by stop and stare. Clara Whitfield, hair in tangles, lips bloodied, hem soaked in mud, knelt on the ground, arms wrapped around her ribs. On her back, a man's boot print stood out like a brand of disgrace. Beside her, her drunken husband laughed, bragging over his trade. $25, a Winchester, and a barrel of corn liquor. More than fair for a useless thing like her. His voice rang sharp as broken glass. Townsfolk shook their heads, but none dared interfere. Out here on the frontier, women being treated like goods wasn't rare. The sheriff hovered nearby, face pale, scratching at his neck as if he wanted to vanish. At last he stammered, holding out the paper. By law, he sold off the right to care for her. Says she can't bear children. His voice trailed off, ashamed of his own words. Then Jonah Callahan appeared, a wealthy rancher, but known for saying little. His sunburned face was carved by weather, his eyes cold and deep as a canyon. He stood silent, looking at Clara, the woman in the mud, her eyes dry of tears, as if listening for something deeper than words. His silence carried more weight than a speech. "If you're buying, best be quick," the sheriff muttered, glancing toward the saloon where the husband had staggered off. "Somebody's got to take her away." Jonah didn't ask about her past, didn't measure her sins. He simply reached into his coat, pulled a stack of bills, and dropped it into the sheriff's trembling hand. No counting, no bargaining. "Help her up," Jonah said quietly, his voice rough as gravel rolling in a dry creek bed. "From now on, she comes with me." The paper money whispered like wind across barren hills. Clara lifted her face, dark eyes fierce, not grateful, but like a faint flame suddenly shielded. No one clapped, no one objected, only the bawl of cattle in the distance, the whine of the wind through eaves, and a contract etched in silence. No wedding vows, no promises, just a cold exchange under a red dust sky. But it was the moment Jonah Callahan and Clara Whitfield's destinies veered into a future no one could predict. The trail from Dusty Hollow to the Callahan Ranch stretched lonesome and dry, the air thick with grit. Hoofbeats echoed steady on hard earth. Clara sat sideways on the saddle, wrapped in a thick wool blanket Jonah had given her. Tangled hair covered half her bruised face, her eyes hollow, fixed on the gray horizon. She spoke no words, not even a sigh. Jonah rode beside her, tall and broad, shoulders darkened by wind and sun. He didn't prod her, didn't break the silence. From time to time his gaze swept over her thin hands clutching the blanket, her spine straight though her body trembled. In her exhaustion he saw not only pain, but something else, something forged like iron in fire. The sun sank behind the mountains, sky blazing bronze. When the lone lanterns of Callahan Ranch glimmered in the dusk, Clara stirred faintly, startled that the ride had ended. Jonah dismounted first, held out a hand. She hesitated, then forced herself down, limping, refusing his help. Jonah only gave a small nod. The ranch loomed plain but sturdy. A big timber house, barn, grain shed, and ranch hands sparking a fire in the yard. Jonah led her into the main house. Floorboards creaked under mud-stained boots. He showed her into a bare room, a small window opening to the dark slope beyond. A single bed, a table, a basin of cold water. Jonah fetched a clean flannel shirt from a chest, set it on the bed, then pointed at the blankets. "Here. You owe me nothing." His voice was low, clipped, but carried the weight of an oath. Clara stood still, eyes blinking, then looked at him directly. A wary look, as though every kindness was a trick after what she had lived through. She didn't answer, only gave a faint nod, lips pressed tight, and turned away. Jonah left the silence untouched. He closed the door, granting her the first privacy she'd known in years. Outside, wind swept the open range, carrying the scent of dry grass and the distant cry of coyotes. In that darkness, two strangers, each bearing scars, began a journey neither could yet see the end of. If it were you, whose side would you stand on? A. Jonah Callahan. Clara Whitfield. Or would you choose another? Leave a comment and let me know you're still riding with the story. The first days at Callahan Ranch passed slowly, quietly, just like Clara herself. She barely stepped past the threshold, lingering in the kitchen or her small room. In the mornings, she swept the wooden floors until not a speck of dust remained. At midday, she stoked the fire and prepared simple meals, salted meat, potatoes, a few slices of bread, but always neat, always enough. At night, the lamplight cast shadows of her hunched figure as she scrubbed each dish, as if that were the only way to keep her mind from splintering. Jonah spoke little, and he never asked questions. He let her choose silence. To most men, a woman's quiet obedience might be welcome, but to Jonah, it felt like a shadow lurking in the house, a constant reminder that Clara hadn't truly lived. Then one afternoon, a brisk wind rattled the dry fields and the setting sun painted the valley red. Jonah was in the barn, pitchfork in hand, sweat soaking his back. Suddenly, Clara appeared in the doorway. Her plain dress bore the dust of the hearth, her hair tied hastily, yet her eyes held an unyielding strength. She stood there for a long moment, as if wrestling with herself before speaking. Her voice was hoarse but clear. "I can help. I'm not broken." Her words cut through the clatter of hooves and the scrape of the pitchfork against the soil. Jonah looked up, their eyes meeting, not guarded, not fearful, but a silent challenge. He said nothing, only turned and handed her the other pitchfork. Clara stepped forward, small hands gripping the handle. At first, her movements were clumsy, but she worked without pause. Each scoop of manure grew stronger, surer, as if every strike proved to herself that she had never truly been defeated. The golden light of sunset poured through the barn slats, casting their two laboring shadows in bronze and dust. They spoke little, just the scrape of pitchforks on the earth, the stamping of horses in their stalls. Jonah's eyes wandered occasionally, catching Clara's wince of pain, her clenched teeth, but she pressed on. A fleeting, tired smile crossed her lips, but it was real enough to make Jonah pause. For the first time since she arrived, he saw a glimmer of light behind that gray, weary face. The sun sank lower, burning the sky a brick red. Clara set the pitchfork down, panting, sweat glistening on her brow. She looked at Jonah, eyes no longer avoiding his gaze. Jonah nodded, quietly, without praise, but the nod carried recognition. Clara pressed her hands together, and for the first time in years, felt she was no longer a castaway. That night, the cabin fell silent. The flickering lamp threw Clara's thin, upright shadow against the wall. She sat at the table, fingers gripping her cup, eyes fixed on the worn wood marked by years of chopping and cutting. Jonah sat opposite, puffing on his pipe, silent as ever. Suddenly, Clara lifted her gaze. Her voice was rough, each word dropping like a stone into a still lake. "Why did you buy me?" The question thickened the air. Jonah froze, halfway through a puff, the half-burned pipe held between calloused fingers. His eyes, deep as a canyon, met hers. He could have lied, made some easy excuse, but instead he spoke slowly, deliberately. "Because no one has the right to throw you away like that." Clara went still. Her gaze softened, no longer taut as in the first days. She lowered her head, whispering almost to herself, "I will be worthy." Jonah said nothing, only nodded softly, a quiet acknowledgement. And in that instant, Clara straightened, eyes igniting with a resolute spark. "I once knew how to shoot." Jonah's eyes narrowed, faint surprise crossing his face. He studied her expression, seeing more than endurance now, a pulse of someone who had fought to survive. Clara continued, voice firmer, "Teach me again. I won't hide in the kitchen forever. I need to remember how to hold a gun like I used to." That night, Jonah did not sleep. He sat in the dark, back against the old wooden chair, eyes drifting over the endless fields to the horizon. Every gust of wind through the porch reminded him of years gone. His wife resting on the southern hill, gunfights survived, and the haunting loneliness that stalked this empty house. He thought his life was closed off, but looking into Clara's eyes, a precarious balance between doubt and fragile trust, he felt a new rhythm stir within. The next morning, sun barely cresting the fence line, Jonah led Clara to the open ground behind the barn. Her hands trembled on the gun he handed her, but her gaze was fierce, determined. "Don't think of this as just a weapon," Jonah said, voice low and hoarse. "Think of it as a chance. In this land, either you take the power to protect yourself, or you remain prey for others." Clara gripped the gun and pulled the trigger. The first shot rang loud, shoulder jolting. The bullet barely grazed the wooden target. Still, she pressed on. One by one, each shot steadied her breathing, sharpened her focus. When a round finally hit dead center, she let out a small laugh, tiny, but ringing like a wake-up bell. Jonah's lips twitched, eyes bright with pride. Yet somewhere beyond the fields, enemies watched. Men who once regarded Clara as property would not let her go so easily. Word of her refuge at Jonah's ranch had spread. A tall gunman named Harlan, once a hired hand in Dodge City, was rounding up some lowlifes from town, promising a generous reward for her return. That afternoon, as Clara practiced horseback riding, Jonah spotted fresh hoof prints along the edge of the clearing. He crouched, fingers brushing the impressions, tightening his gun strap. "They're coming," he murmured, eyes darkening. Clara saw the tension in his face. Fear rose, but this time she was no longer the silent, broken woman. She stepped closer, voice hoarse but resolute. "If they come, I won't run. You've shown me how to stand. Let me fight, even once." Jonah studied her, seeing a woman no longer bowing to fate. He nodded slowly, handing her another pistol. "All right. But remember, in the West, a bullet is only worth its weight if fired with belief in yourself." The sun sank behind the mountains, casting the open field in a blood-red glow. Dust whipped in swirling layers, signaling a night of unrest. In the cabin, Clara cleaned her gun with trembling hands but steady eyes. Jonah stood on the porch, tall against the sunset. They both knew the storm was coming, and in that tense silence their fate would be forged, not only by gunfire, but by the courage newly kindled in the dark. If you were in this place, whose side would you take? A. Jonah Callahan. Clara Whitfield. Or do you have another choice? Leave a comment if you're still riding with this story. Rumors in Dusty Hollow spread faster than desert wind. In just a few weeks, the name Clara Whitfield had become the town's joke, whispered in saloons and on porches alike. People murmured, "Jonah Callahan, the richest man around, went and brought home a barren woman. Might as well be raising a guard dog." Every word cut slowly, like a blunt knife, never ceasing. Clara heard it, of course. The whispers clung to her steps whenever she left the ranch gates, though she rarely dared to go far. But that morning, Jonah said they needed to ride into town for salt, bullets, and a few coils of rope. He handed her the reins, motioning for her to ride along. For the first time since being sold, Clara stepped into the street not as a shadow at someone's heel. The general store sat on the corner, where gossip gathered like dust in the wind. When Jonah pushed open the door, the bell jingled, drawing every eye in the room. Farmer wives, young cowboys picking tobacco, all froze, staring at Clara as though she were a stain in the middle of the market. She felt every gaze. Her heart pounded, fingers tightening on her skirt. In that instant, old memories surged, curses, slaps that stung, days she'd been treated worse than livestock. Throat tight, she could have bowed her head and returned to that fragile shadow of herself. But this time was different. Clara drew a deep breath, lifted her chin. Her deep blue eyes swept over the room, neither dodging nor resisting, simply taking it in with calm. That simple lift of her head made the room pause. They expected submission, but instead saw a woman thin yet upright, shoulders squared, steps steady. Jonah said nothing, merely setting down the gunpowder, salt, and rope on the counter. Yet in his quiet gaze was subtle pride. Clara stood beside him, never stepping back. When the storekeeper handed over the goods, she took them, placing them into the basket, as if she'd done it all her life. A farmer's wife let out a faint snort, but dared not speak. A young cowboy watched, his eyes no longer pure disdain, but tinged with curiosity. Clara did not smile, yet her lips pressed together, and a faint spark gleamed in her eyes. Stepping back into the wind, her hair whipped free. For the first time, Clara felt she was no longer the discarded shadow. Jonah, handing the reins back to her, spoke only one short phrase: "Keep going like that." Simple words, yet Clara realized she was not just surviving, she was slowly reclaiming herself. Late that afternoon, the Dusty Hollow saloon rang with drunken laughter. Thomas Whitfield, Clara's ex-husband, waved his bottle, boasting to the crowd, "I once sold my wife, $25, an old gun, and a barrel of corn liquor. Never was there a deal sweeter than that." The laughter followed, harsh and cruel. Cowboys slapped the tables, spilling whiskey onto the floorboards. The sheriff lurked in the corner, pretending not to hear, for he had witnessed that shameful transaction firsthand. The saloon doors swung open. Clara entered. Simple dress, hollowed face, eyes sharp and cold. The laughter faded, replaced by tense silence. No one expected the woman once treated as property to step into the raucous room. Thomas froze, then laughed. "Well, well, my old piece of merchandise. How's that Callahan treating you?" Clara said nothing. She stepped straight toward him, fist raised. The punch landed with a crisp thud, knocking Thomas to the floor. The bottle shattered into shards. The room gasped. Thomas scrambled up, face red with liquor and humiliation. He drew a dagger from his boot, growling, "You forget who you belong to?" Clara stood tall, unwavering. From her waistband she drew her pistol. The steel gleamed under the lamplight as she leveled it at his chest. Her voice rang cold and steady. You signed the papers. I belong to no one." The room held its breath. But Clara didn't stop there. She reached into her coat, pulling out the crumpled paper, the very document that once sold her. She raised it for the entire saloon to see, tearing it into pieces. The sound of ripping paper fell like ashes, erasing forever the chains of humiliation that had bound her life. Thomas growled, dagger trembling. But when he looked into Clara's eyes no longer fearful, he faltered. Her pistol didn't shake. The crowd went silent. No one laughed. All understood. The woman before them was no longer the one they had once sold. Cursing under his breath, Thomas hid his knife, staggering backward toward the door. Clara lowered her gun and turned, walking past the crowd. No one dared stop her. Jonah stood outside, calm, eyes quietly proud. Clara raised her head as she passed him. For the first time, the entire town witnessed it. The chains of the past had broken. Clara was no longer a victim. If you were in this situation, whose side would you take? Otto. Jonah Callahan. B. Clara Whitfield. Or do you have another choice? Leave a comment to let me know you're still riding with this story. Morning came with a dry wind whipping across the Callahan fields, carrying the acrid smell of smoke. Jonah rode out to the edge of the property, and what he saw made his jaw clench. The sturdy wooden fence had been cut into neat sections, as if someone had deliberately carved it. Beyond that, open lot. 3 cattle lay scorched, their bodies blackened, smoke still curling from the remnants of smoldering hay. Jonah said nothing. He dismounted, calloused hand brushing over the charred fence plank. His gaze sank, glowing like embers amid the ashes. Behind him, Clara stepped forward, her dark skirt fluttering in the wind, eyes icy as they took in the scene. "This wasn't an accident," she said quietly, each word measured, deliberate. Jonah glanced at her, catching that steely resolve. He knew Clara had grown familiar with the stench of cruelty. Having survived the shadows, she could read the hand of a human instigator better than anyone. Clara bent down, lifting a scrap of oil-soaked cloth from the ashes. The pungent smell hit her nostrils. She lifted her head, eyes flashing. "Someone wants to send a warning. And I have a hunch. There's only one man cruel enough to do it." Jonah's fingers tightened, but he let her speak. Harlan Pike. The name cut through the air like a blade. Harlan Pike, the North Ridge land baron, wealthy, ruthless, notorious for expanding his territory with violence. To him, land wasn't to live on, but to wield power. And Jonah Callahan, with his fertile fields and thriving stock, was a thorn he would never ignore. Jonah drew a long breath, eyes fixed northward, where hazy hills kissed the horizon. He didn't answer, but he knew Clara had guessed correctly. Clara straightened, skirt dusted with ash, voice ringing clear as a challenge. "He thinks I weaken you. He'll try again. But if Harlan Pike wants a fight, he'll soon learn. We're not as soft as he thinks." The wind swept across the charred fields, lifting scraps of burnt cloth into the sky, a warning of the storm to come. Jonah tightened the reins in his hands, staring at Clara. He saw in her not just anger, but a fire of determination, an intensity even he hadn't expected to rely upon. In that moment, both understood. Callahan Ranch had entered a new war. No longer was it the wounds of the past. They were facing an enemy defined by greed and power. Clara wasn't one to wait idly for danger to knock. After the scorched cattle, she knew only one way to uncover the truth: to step straight into the lair of those sowing chaos. Late that afternoon, as the sun spilled through the trees, she slipped quietly from the ranch, hiding the revolver Jonah had taught her to wield inside her coat. Jonah noticed, riding at a distance to keep watch. He did not stop her. He only wanted to make sure she wasn't alone. Her destination was a rundown saloon at the edge of North Ridge, a haven for men who trafficked women and brokered shady deals. Inside the stinking, tobacco-filled room, Clara found the man she remembered, Mason Crow, a middleman in many of the town's cruel trades. Bald head, scruffy beard, shifty eyes, counting filthy coins on the table. Clara's boots creaked across the rotten floorboards. Mason looked up, startled. He thought she had vanished into oblivion. "Oh, I thought you were dead," he sneered. "Back as the lady boss of Callahan Ranch, huh?" Clara didn't answer. She drew her pistol, barrel black as coal, aimed squarely at him. The scattered laughter in the room died down. "Who cut the fence?" she asked, voice cold as steel. Mason chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Just passing along the word, girl. Women like you don't know the games men play." A shot cracked. The bullet slammed into the wooden table inches from Mason's hand. Splinters flew, a whiskey glass tipped, spilling foul liquid across the floor. Mason jumped back, sweating. Clara stepped closer, gun raised, eyes unwavering, lips pressed like carved stone. "Speak!" Mason's gaze flicked from the barrel to her steely eyes. He swallowed, voice trembling. "It's Harlan Pike. He claims Callahan land should be his. He wants you and Jonah gone, as a warning to everyone." Clara tilted her head, expression unchanged. Then, suddenly, she squeezed the trigger. The bullet whistled and struck Mason's thigh. He screamed, collapsing from the chair. The others in the saloon recoiled, too afraid to intervene. "This is just a warning," Clara said, her tone eerily calm. "Next time, if you hide something, I won't aim for the leg." Blood stained the wooden floor. Mason writhed, then screamed out every secret he knew. Jonah, standing in the shadows outside, watched it all. He was astonished. This was no longer the trembling woman he had pulled from the mud. Clara had stepped into the darkness and used its fire to fight back. When she emerged, gun still in hand, Jonah followed silently. In the crimson glow of sunset, he realized, for the first time, she hadn't just defended herself. She had chosen to attack. If you were in this situation, whose side would you take? Ain Jonah Callahan. Clara Whitfield. Or do you have another choice? Leave a comment to let me know you're still riding with this story. The river that split the border between Callahan Land and North Ridge had always been the lifeline for both ranches. But that night, with the moon buried under black clouds, Jonah and Clara rode along its banks, carrying dynamite. They worked in silence, the only sounds the slap of water and the pounding of their hearts. When the fuse was lit, the ground shuddered, water choked off and forced to spill toward Callahan Land. By morning, North Ridge lay cracked and dry as old hide. Harlan Pike's wheat fields sagged, the grass curled and yellow. Word spread quick. His crops were dying of thirst. Harlan roared with fury. He wasn't used to losing, much less being challenged by a woman. He hired a dozen gunmen, mercenaries with eyes cold as steel. Among them were sharpshooters who could kill from shadows no one else could see. The first shot came from the southern ridge that night. The bullet tore through the roof beam of the main house. Ranch hands panicked. Children cried out. Jonah instantly doused the lamps and motioned everyone to the floor. But Clara was different. She didn't flinch. Her eyes lit with steel, reflecting the fading glow of the oil lamp. "They want to test us in the dark," she rasped. "Fine. Let's show them this place ain't soft." From that moment, Clara took command. She gathered the hands, young boys, old men more used to plows than rifles. Yet under her sharp voice they stood as soldiers. She split them into groups, 2 on the water tower, 3 guarding the stock pens, the rest along the fence line. She showed them how to lie hidden in shadows, how to use fire to flush out enemies, and above all, shoot to drop them, not to kill. Jonah stood aside, silent. He had led men in war, but never had he seen such resolve in a woman once dismissed as nothing. Clara moved between posts, gun at her hip, hair loose in the night wind. Under the pale moon, she looked less like a broken shadow and more like a commander. When the second volley rang out, the ranch no longer panicked. Callahan's people fired back, short, calculated shots. The dark figures faltered, leaving bloodstains in the dust as they retreated. Clara stood on the porch, revolver in hand, gaze cutting through the night like a dare. This is our land, and every bullet will be answered. The wind howled across the fields, heavy with smoke and dry straw. Then, when the moon slipped behind clouds, riders stormed down from the north like a storm front. Harlan Pike's men smashed through the fence, torches raised, hurling fire into the hay barn. Flames leapt skyward in an instant, painting the night red. Ranch hands panicked, but Clara had prepared. Since Harlan's first threat, she dug shallow trenches around the barn, set barrels of water, laid hidden obstacles. As the fire caught, she shouted, voice hoarse but firm, "Spring the traps!" Water doused the first blaze, while jagged glass and iron scattered in the dirt sent enemy horses rearing. Gunfire cracked through the night. Clara stood at the center, revolver steady, every shot deliberate, dropping one raider after another. Jonah led a countercharge from behind the stock pens, but he saw Clara was keeping the rhythm of battle. She ran the porch line, barking orders like a seasoned captain. Harlan's hired guns, used to fast, ruthless strikes, stumbled against the fierce resistance, blinded by firelight and chaos. One brute lunged from the side, knife flashing. Clara spun, fired, but the bullet only grazed his shoulder. He roared and charged. She stumbled back, tripping over a charred beam. Death loomed close. A gunshot thundered, but not from her hand. The man froze, eyes wide, then crumpled to the dirt. Out of the shadows stepped a stranger. Dusty coat, eyes dark, pistol smoking in his grip. Clara froze. Jonah did too, his face struck dumb by the firelight. The man's features were unmistakable. Matthew Callahan, his younger brother, long believed dead in the border wars. "Matt." Jonah's voice broke. Matthew gave a slight nod, no words wasted. He turned to Clara, voice gravelly from smoke and gunpowder. "Keep your gun. I'll cover your back." The fight surged again. Jonah snapped awake, shouting his men to rally. Clara gripped her revolver tighter, heart pounding, but spirit unshaken. The man thought lost to death now stood among them, pulling them back from the edge of defeat. By the time the gunfire faded, the hay barn was a wet heap of ash. Harlan's men lay scattered, some dead, others fled into the dark. Clara stood gasping, eyes fixed on Matthew, the stranger, the blood kin of Jonah, and proof that sometimes, even in the fire of chaos, fate could place an unexpected hand of deliverance. If you were in this moment, whose side would you stand on? A. Jonah Callahan. B. Clara Whitfield. Or would you choose another? Leave a comment to let me know you're still riding with this story. That morning, gray clouds blanketed the Callahan Valley. Wind hissed through the charred fence posts, carrying the sting of smoke left behind from the raid. Jonah stood at the ranch gate, revolver slung low at his side, eyes sharp as honed steel. He knew the enemy wasn't finished, and sure enough, dust rose on the horizon, rolling like a storm. Harlan Pike rode a massive black horse, nearly 20 gunmen at his back, bandoliers crossing their chests. When they reined up before the gate, silence smothered the land. Only the crack of wind whipping the dry grass remained. Harlan leaned forward, voice booming with scorn. "Jonah Callahan, the whole territory's laughing at you. You let a woman do your fighting?" Jonah never blinked. He stepped forward, voice low and rough, each word hammered like a nail into oak. "She didn't fight for me. She fought for herself." Harlan faltered, then barked out a laugh, harsh, metallic. The laugh died with the crack of a gun. Harlan howled, clutching his thigh, blood soaking his saddle. Clara stepped from the porch, hair whipping wild, eyes blazing like coals. Smoke still curled from the pistol in her hand. Harlan's men gasped, but none moved forward. Not because of the gun, but because of the presence of the woman standing straight before them, radiating a strength that left no room for fear. Clara advanced a few paces, her voice cutting the silence clean. "The woman I was is dead. What's left? You'll never defeat." Harlan's face twisted with pain and humiliation. He tried to lift his revolver, but his trembling hand let it drop to the dirt. His men shifted uneasily. One fool twitched toward his gun, but Jonah's Winchester lifted in a single smooth motion. He didn't fire. He didn't need to. The point was made. The air stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Clara lowered her pistol, refusing to waste another round. She let Harlan stagger back onto his horse, blood dripping down the trail. He turned, screaming, "I'll be back!" But even his roar couldn't hide the truth. He had been broken. Not by a bullet, but by the shame of falling to a woman he once scorned. The riders wheeled and retreated, red dust trailing behind. Silence settled heavy over the yard. Clara stood still, gun lowered, chest heaving, but eyes steady. Jonah stepped to her side, gave a single nod. In that moment, both understood. Clara was no longer bound by the past. She had carved her own strength. Spring returned. The prairie bloomed green, as if the earth itself sought to cover the scars of Callahan Ranch. Fences stood tall again, barns full as if they'd never burned, cattle bellowed under the sun. Yet the greatest change wasn't the land, but the woman on the porch, hands dirt-stained, eyes shining like never before. Clara knelt by the garden bed, pressing seeds into the soil. No trace remained of the woman who lived in fear, shoulders hunched in shame. In her place stood someone who chose to plant her life anew with her own two hands. Jonah sat in the porch chair, half-burned cigarette between his fingers, eyes fixed on her. When Clara rose, sweat on her brow, Jonah stepped closer. He said little, just extended his hand. She placed her calloused palm in his, fingers closing softly. Wind rustled across the fields as Jonah murmured, "No papers, no preacher, just you choosing to stay." Clara met his gaze. In her eyes lived every scar, but also new faith. She nodded, voice quiet but firm. "I choose." No wedding, no white dress, only two hands joined, a vow with no witness. In that silence they both knew it was enough. Time passed, and word of the battle at Callahan Ranch spread across the frontier. Tales twisted in retelling. Some spoke of Harlan Pike shot down in disgrace, others of mercenaries driven off in a storm of gunfire. But most whispered of Clara Whitfield, the woman once sold like livestock. In saloons where men had laughed before, voices now dropped to hushed tones. "She ain't the woman who was bought. She's the woman no man could ever buy." The phrase turned to legend, carried on travelers' lips, woven into the lullabies of frontier mothers telling their children, there was once a woman who rewrote her fate, not with tears, but with will and fire. At dusk, when the sun sank behind the ridges, Jonah and Clara sat side by side on the porch, hands still clasped. No words were needed. They hadn't come together out of pity, but out of strength found in one another. From that day forward, Callahan Ranch was no longer just land. It became a symbol, a vow forged in ashes, where love and freedom ran as deep as blood in the soil. The story of Jonah and Clara doesn't end with gunfire, but with a quiet rebirth on ground still warm with ash. A woman once sold like property chose to rise, not just to survive but to live free. In that choice she found a love that needed no paper, no preacher, only two hearts keeping the same beat. Maybe we all carry old scars, chains that seem to lock life shut. But like Clara, sometimes one bold decision is enough to rewrite destiny. If it were you, would you bow in silence or stand like Clara? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and pass this story along so we can keep the fire of the Wild West burning.